Luis Antonio Dominguez. I was born in Los Angeles, California, right there in General County Hospital. I am the electrical integration and test lead for the assembly, test, and launch operations team for the Psyche mission right now. My mom, she's from Mexico. She's from a small town in Mexico called Netlapa, which is in the state of Guerrero, which is very close to the capital of Guerrero. And my dad is from Honduras. He's from Salamao Lancho. Yeah, it's a small town in Olancho, which is one of the central states in Honduras. They're both younger than me, yeah, we were both born and raised together, and one of them is studying to be he just finished being studying to be a PA, so he's now a PA, and the other one wants to be a lawyer, but he's working as a legal assistant. Parents both work very hard, right, and they always had to be working, and so I kind of would fill in as well and kind of help and take care of my little brothers as best I could. I was also a little bit older than them. It was about a 5-6 year age gap between me and both of them. So I was definitely taking care of them when I was little. I think that was always something that I was naturally kind of just a curious kid. I always really enjoyed reading almanacs and kind of just being someone who knew some random knowledge about something. Yeah. That was cool to me. So I always had a lot of curiosity, and my mom and my dad, they definitely nurtured it, and kind of, even though we couldn't afford the new almanacs, I remember 4 or 5 years old, because we'd get them at the the second store, in Goodwill, and it's the old almanacs, and I'd always feel like I was a little out of date, and I'm like, but that's kind of what drove my curiosity. And overall, just tenacity is just, I think it's something that you develop when you grow up in an immigrant household. It's one of the things that I always tell my coworkers is, like, I always feel bad when I take a day off from work because I'm sick. To me, it's like a weakness. Like my parents used to be all feverish and barely, especially now with COVID, like that's like a no-no, but immigrant mentality of even though it gets tough and it's hard and it's painful, you keep working and you keep working at it. So that kind of developed what I'd say is like a tenacity for me, and kind of gave me the drive to not be afraid to fail. That's one of the other things that you have to be ready for, is failure. Life's just going to be full of failures, and so just prepare yourself for them. And then a healthy dose of altruism. That's just something that seeing my parents growing up, they would always help people out, giving people money out on the side of the street, buying frutas from el vendedero, just to like understanding, like helping these people out helps out the local socio, kind of economics of the situation, right? It help people out locally, right? And good things happen. And so that's kind of where I come from. It is, if you go out there and you do good things and you help people out, good things will come out of it. And so just, continue doing that wherever you're at. And then courage, that one I'd say is probably the hardest one. That it was the one that took me the longest to develop. Because I would say I for a long time I didn't have courage. I didn't apply to like the MITs or any of like the big schools, because I didn't think I was worth it. I didn't think I could hang, right? And I only applied to CSUs. I only applied to Cal States because they were free. I could apply to 5 for free. Cal Poly Pomona was actually the first one to accept me, and I kind of just said I was like, oh, this is great. A school
Yeah.
wants me.
Yeah. Exactly.
And yeah, it took me a while to kind of see value in myself, which I think is probably something that's very difficult to achieve, especially when you come from, you know, deprived socioeconomic backgrounds. As when you're growing up, you know, sometimes in impoverished areas, you see things that you normally shouldn't see, and you know, it's hard to believe that, you know, I would have never thought I could be where I'm at today growing up. It's not anything I could have imagined. And so I think it's having the courage, you know, to stand up from that. I mean, overall, my family really valued education, and so I understood I was going to go to college. I didn't know what I was going to study. I mean, I knew because I mean, I figured that out in seventh grade that I wanted to be an aerospace engineer.
Mm.
But I wanted to build airplanes, and that was what I wanted to do. And so that's kind of what drove me, at the end of the day, to go to school. But even throughout that whole time, even though I was like, okay, I'll be an aerospace engineer, in the back of my mind, I always had backup options. I was like, okay, if I can't get into engineering school, I'll join the military. And if I can't, and you know, if I don't cut it in the military, you know, I'll be a mechanic, you know, because my dad was a mechanic. And so I was
Yeah.
like, I know I could fix cars, I could do that. But it was kind of just always having the fallback options, which is a good thing to have.
Yeah.
But it also sets you up for like, you set yourself short. Well, I fell in love with airplanes, and so my my dad was a mechanic, so and I always thought it was interesting. Like my dad had the ability to, like, he's the type of mechanic where he can just like listen to a car and tell you what's wrong with it, or like just like, you know, that he's just got that second nature, of just understanding cars. And I was like, oh, I want to be that with airplanes. My dad was going to study civil engineering in Honduras, but just due to the political situation there, he got pulled into the military, and
Mm.
he didn't want to be in the military, so that's why he left.
Yeah.
But he always wanted to be an engineer. I didn't know that actually growing up. I never knew that until he told me at some point that he wanted to be a civil engineer, and I was like, oh, I want to study aerospace. I mean, my mom, you know, she gets every certification out there, you know, like yeah, she'll go to like classes at like LACC, and like just get like, you know, like she's like, ah, estoy certificada en hacer flores, and it's like it's like she got her license to like be a hair, you know, to do hair and do like. It was interesting, kind of living on both sides of the fence, per se. My mom is heavily Mexican, and so there's a heavy kind of Mexican influence overall here in Southern California. And so I definitely got the Mexican culture aspect of it, but it was also interesting having my family from Central America, and seeing, you know, the nuances of the cultural nuances between, you know, Mexican and Honduran, and you know, trying to figure out which soccer team I should root for. So I would never take a choice. I always chose the US. I never really got to know my abuelos very well. I very briefly met them. I was the only one to meet them out of my brothers, because they passed away before my younger brothers were born. And so I took one trip down to Mexico and Honduras. I was probably maybe about 3 or 4 years old. I visit my mom's dad, my grandpa. He was her last, you know, her last parent, and he passed away. And then I also visited my grandma, who was my dad's last parent as well, and so she also passed away. So I never really, unfortunately, got the opportunity to get to know them better. I wish I could have, but
Right.
just distance, right? I remember we got into a big accident when we were in Mexico. It was just like a huge accident. I remember this lady was like just bleeding all over. It was that was one of the few things that I remember from going to Mexico, and then and riding my my grandpa's like horses and stuff, and then visiting my grandma over there. I don't remember as much visiting my grandma in Honduras. Um, but she was a little poor. She didn't have as much land as my grandpa. To Vermont Elementary School, and then went to Audubon Middle School, which is over near the Crenshaw area. And then high school, I went to Westchester High School. For Audubon and Westchester, I had gotten accepted into the magnet program, so I was part of the magnet schools for both of those schools. And yeah, it was cool. I mean, I was very much a loner. You know, the nerdy, quiet kid that,
Yeah.
especially like, you know, middle school, I really liked hanging out in the library. And that's kind of where where I fell in love with airplanes. Was I started looking at books about airplanes in the library. And they have different focuses. So like some of the magnet programs will be more focused in like science, like biology, if you want to do like medical school, things like that. So like Bravo, I think, was one of the was a medical magnet, and so they focus more on like biology, sciences, and things like that. But Westchester was an aerospace magnet. That's why I went there, because it was aerospace magnet, even though they didn't have every aerospace classes when I got there. You know, they have the AP classes for math and science and things like that, but there was no class for aerospace or anything like that. I was expecting like, oh, I'm going to go there, I'm going to take a class on aerospace, learn about airplanes, but that never happened. They used to have classes like that, but then like due to funding cuts and things, like it just went away. Oh, absolutely. And actually, so when I did high school, you know, I took all the AP math classes. I took my AP calculus. I didn't take AP physics, but I did take, like, you know, most of the AP science classes that I could. And when I got to Cal Poly, I actually retook all my calculus classes, even though I had passed all the AP tests to kind of to prove that I knew calculus. So I actually just retook all the classes in college for calculus, like starting from like the beginning, just to start fresh and make sure I didn't miss anything.
Yeah.
And then yeah, overall, I mean, I did really well in college. My first 3 years, I was doing really well. I think I had like a 3.9, like 8 GPA or something like that. And then I got a job at JPL, and I started slacking. And it was also just juggling work, juggling, you know, it's just juggling more things. It did end up affecting my GPA, but I dropped down to like a 3. I think when I graduated, I was like 3.89 or 3.85. But it wasn't as good as when I was, you know, solely focused on school. But even then, I was still always working. You know, I always had a job when I was in college, starting from, you know, day one.
Yeah.
Whether it was working at the Carl's Jr., working at the Taco Bell, or you know, whatever spot I could work at.
Yeah.
And even doing like gardening off on the side, you know, with my uncle. That actually paid pretty well. Also, I mean, as I was going to school, my little brothers were also still growing up as well. They were still in middle school, high school, and kind of, so I was still heavily involved in you know, taking them to school, taking them to their soccer practices, kind of, you know, helping out my parents right where I could. I am the electrical integration and test lead for the assembly, test, and launch operations team for the Psyche mission right now.
Okay.
And yeah, it basically involves putting together all the electronics onto the spacecraft and making sure that they're going to work in space. I had no idea what JPL was to begin with. So when they called me back, I was like, who? I gave my resume out to a bunch of employers that was just trying to get an internship anywhere. And JPL was the first one to call me back. And then I was like, JPL, you know, I Googled them and I was like, oh, and then when I found out who they were, I was like, yeah, I definitely want to work here. I told my parents, and you know, they didn't know what it was either, right? They didn't know what JPL was either. And I'm like, oh, it's actually a NASA Space Center. And then they're like, oh, you know, they were all like super happy about it. So the first project I worked on was Curiosity, which was the kind of the precursor to Perseverance. So the first rover we sent back in 2009. And that was the first project that I worked on. And there I kind of learned my chops. I learned how to pull, I worked on the team that pulled together the test rover that we have here on Earth that we call Maggie. Started there. I kind of helped work with the team that built the test rover, and then after it launched, they started the Perseverance program, kind of the initial development and things like that. I wasn't initially involved on the very initial phases of the development of the project, but once I got an opportunity to work on all the motors and all the actuators, then I got involved again into the Perseverance program. And then I worked kind of testing and selecting all the actuators that we were going to use for the spacecraft, and then putting them through, qualification programs, developing qualification programs. And then I got an opportunity to be the deputy electrical lead for the flight vehicle. And so I jumped at that, and now I'm the electrical lead for another vehicle. I'm also doing like a double. I'm a deputy systems lead as well for that vehicle as well. The electrical and the systems teams work kind of hand in hand. The electrical kind of more focuses on, let me make sure all these boxes are put together and everything's wired up properly. And then the systems team kind of takes a bigger kind of perspective and says like, okay, does this system do what it's supposed to do? Do these computers work how they should be working together? And how do we prove that it's going to work when we get to space? Back into it in about 2014, I'd say. And then I was on the project until 2020. So about 6 years. Yeah. And that's just from what we call phase C, which is the implementation phase to the operations phase. There's like phase A, where it's like, planning phase, where it's just like conceptual, everything's like just concept and just an idea. And I've had an opportunity to work on some of those. Like I worked on a proposal for a telescope to study black holes. That is, I mean, any exploration in general, that's the cool part about it, is being able to go to places that no one's ever been to, no one's ever imagined, and kind of discovering new ways of doing things. That's one of the other things that I really like about JPL is, I'm kind of encouraged to learn about as much as I can about whatever I want to. I think it's important that we explore space because it gives us interesting challenges that we'll never experience if we just live our sheltered lives. Right. Yeah, you're thinking in terms of if we were to find life that is intelligent life, or we would consider intelligent life. And I think to some extent that's also kind of being transformed, or at least our perception of what intelligent life is, because we're finding more and more that things that we thought were so basic, so primordial, so unintelligent, actually have some incredible intelligence within them, and have the ability to plan and things that, so I think we'll probably run into aliens. They probably won't be the walking kind, but it's such a big universe, as Carl Sagan would say, it'd be such a waste of space. It'd be a game changer, lead to a lot of soul searching and a lot of a lot of different belief structures. For me, the most gratifying thing is telling kids about it and watching them smile, and like seeing their eyes light up, or like when you hit someone and they're like, oh, that's cool. That's really what I enjoy about it. Yeah, it's just being involved. If I have, some spare time, and I'm not doing anything, I have an hour here, an hour there, 30 minutes here, and someone asked me to do a talk at a high school or at a middle school, it's sure, no problem. Especially now with all the remote capabilities, it's just so much easier
Right.
to do those sorts of talks. But even before that, I was just, I was driving around LA, going to talk at like high schools, going to talk at middle schools or elementary schools. I was heavily involved with the Adelante Youth Alliance
Okay.
in Pasadena when they were doing the Adelante Young Men's Conference, because I think that's such a powerful way of actually getting kids to do stuff,
Mhm.
is showing them people that are doing things that look like them, because it actually gives them the belief that they can get there. Because a lot of times that's what they're lacking. So exposure is like one of the big keys that I kind of feel really helps kids. You expose them to different ideas. And even if they don't, like, I tell them, like, even if you don't want to get into engineering, you don't want to you're not into space, just like, go out there and learn about stuff that interests you.
Right.
The world's much bigger than the world that you're in right now. And don't let that world close in on you. One thing that I wish I had done was studied physics as opposed to engineering. And I tell this to kids all the time because, like, physics gives you the tools to, like, do whatever you want. And like engineering, you're using equations that they develop in physics, but the raw tools are developed in physics. And a lot of times kids don't think that physics can be a degree that they'll do anything
Right.
with. But like,
Right.
if you have a physics degree, bankers will pay you a ton of money. It doesn't, like, a ton of people will pay you a ton of money with a physics degree to do stuff. You don't have to be a physicist, especially growing up like in an impoverished area. You don't recognize, because you don't know any physicists, right? You've
Yeah.
never met a
Yeah.
physicist, and they are not someone who's like attainable, or someone that you could be.
Mhm.
It just seems so esoteric and kind of surreal. So I always tell kids, if you can do physics, if you're really interested in just being able to do things and manipulate the world. I mean, it's also driven by the immigrant mentality, I believe, of let me just put my head down and do what I'm told. And so you kind of get into a belief that you aren't good enough, you aren't worth it, that you can't do something, just like I said with the physicist, right? Like, I would have never imagined myself as someone capable of being a physicist, capable of being an Einstein or an Isaac Newton. But you can be, and
Yeah.
anyone can be, honestly. Einstein, didn't even have a degree, and he learned most of what he learned in a patent office. He didn't go to school, no one else taught him. So it's really about just finding the way to get the spark started for you, and then cultivating that fire. So I'm finishing up this project, Psyche. Hopefully, that goes well. That should be landing or getting to the asteroid in like 2026. That's like a 1 month or a 1 month fellowship in Europe, and then come back and see what's available in terms
Okay.
of projects. My boss has a couple projects that they kind of want me to start working on, but we'll see. I don't know. Sometimes I feel like I want to get into politics, but I feel like that's such a wasted, such a waste, a waste of time. But it's like, it's a possible way to effectuate change, and I feel like I'm doing that right now. So
Yeah.
up until it gets to the point where I feel like I'm not doing anything, then that's when I'll change.
Yeah.
When it feels like I'm not pushing the needle, when it feels like I'm not helping out any kids, when it feels like I need to go do something else, potentially. But I really like JPL. It's an amazing place to work. Back in college, I wrote a paper for something that I had called the South Central Los Angeles Rehabilitation Project, like indoor farms, like in South Central into like trailers, and then use that to provide like subsidized food to like local communities, and then kind of like plant them all around LA, and kind of have like a central base like in South Central, and then partner with different universities so that you have like universities. I was kind of thinking like almost like the way Caltech does things, where it's like, you know, you do research and development, like, and so like make South Central research and development hub. Because I think the future is going to be, we're going to have to start planting our food indoors. It's going to get too hot. I'm thankful to be kind of part of this, you know, this initial part of the project and kind of getting it started. I'm glad to do whatever I can to help any kid. I mean, the way I see it, you know, if I can change one kid's life and, you know, just one time by one word, you know, it's worth it. I've never taken a DNA test. More so because I'm just like not that interested. Can I say? I already know I'm a mutt. I already know I'm a mutt. I mean, I've probably got, you know, some you know, native, you know, American blood in me, some African blood in me. My dad's from Honduras, so he's definitely got some African in him. Then you've got some Spanish influences, and you know, and yeah, that's probably it, right? And understanding that a little bit more, and understanding how incredibly complex they really were, even though in general, like, you know, historical, in most historical contexts, at least they're brushed over. What I feel like in terms of what they teach you here in the US. Oh yeah, just, you know, it's amazing, right? Like they just found the ruins right there around Tikal, right, where it was, you know, initially thought that, you know, only a couple of people lived there, and then enormous civilizations everywhere, all over the Americas, and we don't know a lot about that history because a lot of it was destroyed. I also find it very sad that, I mean, in general, right, a lot of the very indigenous communities, the more proper indigenous communities are, you know, often kind of trampled in Latin America. And they're kind of just shoved aside and not really appreciated for what they really are in terms of culture, and just, you know, how much cultural influence they can have. You know, one of the things that I always find interesting is, like, you know, like mathematics. Like if you study the history of mathematics, right? For a long time, there was no concept of zero, right, in mathematics, but the initial concept of a zero was actually a Mesoamerican concept, and it took a while till it actually came into like discovery of what zero is. I think it was in actually in Saudi Arabia. Yeah, it was one of the guy that invented algebra kind of eventually, I think, figured it out. The overall, the Mayan calendar, right, and well, actually the Olmec calendar, because it's based on the Olmec calendar, but how, I mean, that is just, you know, they figured out the rhythms of the universe, the period, you know, the periodicity of like stars, and then they use that to generate their calendars, which were, you know, to this day are way more precise than even the calendar system we are using today, right? That's why we have to do leap years, like leap seconds, you know, things like that, because we need to readjust our time, because it's not based on some, you know, very periodic cycle. Whereas the other one was, the Mayans actually kind of they might have had it right. The Olmecs or whoever. It's an incredible concept, and it's just like, it just shows, like, you know, the ingenuity that humans will do, right? And, you know, we're all just pattern finding machines. So yeah, it's really interesting. my mom was Mexican and she was the one making the food. So most of our food in the household was Mexican food, American food for my dad. And she would make Central American food as well. In terms of like, different sopas de mariscos and kind of things like that, or that my dad really liked, like sopa de jaiba is like his big his big thing with like coconut milk. It's like they used to stretch like the masa for the egg. So the egg, they would mix it with masa so that you could stretch it out and then make more of it and just feed more people. So it was just like he's like, can you make me an egg with masa? And so just like mix it up and then you just like cook it. It's like, wow, okay, but they did this to save money. I mean, when I was growing up, there was a lot of pupuserias and kind of like American food, but not necessarily Honduran food. There's not a lot of Honduran restaurants, 2 or 3 in LA. And my dad likes to go to, especially when family comes over. He's like, let's go to the Honduran restaurant. They eat this every day. We'll probably take them somewhere else. Of music, I like all sorts of music. My musical taste is extremely varied. It goes, I like it all. Yeah, as long as it sounds good to my ears, the way I like to put it. Like I'll listen to anything, rancheras to like, to salsa, to merengue, it's just like, it's everywhere. And the other thing was my uncle was a DJ. I used to go DJ with him. So I would just like listen to music in the background and just, so I know I've heard a lot of different music, a lot of old time music, like old school, like, Los Angeles Negros and things like that. Like just, it gives you like, good memories. And I do love video games. I love video games. I love, and then in terms of sitcoms, like, my favorite show is The Office. Favorite documentary, You Can't Be Neutral on a Moving Train. Howard Zinn was like one of the big like historical author influences in my life, in terms of like actually discovering that history is multifaceted and it's not simple, it's not easy, and it doesn't just to go from point A to point B. It's like all over the place. And it made me appreciate, like, I wish they taught history a little bit more like that, as opposed to just like being so regimented and it's like, and then we went to this and it was like, well, explain why.